Please welcome Larry Doran from Imperium Energy with his presentation, The Power to Grow. This presentation will explore the magnitude and nature of the power supply required to support Greenstone's forecast growth over the next decade. S'il vous plaît, veuillez accueillir Larry Doran de Imperium Energy avec sa présentation Le pouvoir de grandir. Cette présentation traitera des ressources en énergie nécessaires pour supporter la croissance de Greenstone pour les 10 prochaines années.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. And I'm very happy to be back again. I'll be even happier when my slide shows up. Right. Oh, now we're on to number 2. Okay, first of all, I'd like to recognize the theme for this year's expo, strengthening our roots. I think it's terribly important, and it's a great analogy for what really has to happen for Greenstone to move forward. You, more than anyone else, understands that any community needs various ingredients to grow. The only ingredient I am capable of talking about is electricity, and it's only one of the many ingredients you're going to need to grow. But I think the root, if you do not have a root, if you do not have an ability to have a supply of power that's reliable and cost-effective, in a modern age like today, no community can grow. And what I'm going to speak about today is the fact that Greenstone has tremendous potential to ellipse our dreams. And some of the other speakers have said, well, the Ring of Fire may be a bit delayed or this, but they're still optimistic, and I'm very optimistic it'll move forward. But I have to stress to you, if you do not have a reliable, cost-effective power supply, you can't expect industry to move forward. You can't expect population growth. It's an essential way of life. I mentioned this is the second time I spoke here. I was here last year, and I spoke about powering Greenstone and the Ring of Fire. And before I go on to talk about where we are today, I'd like to review what we spoke of a year ago. Now, a year ago, we had this map. The map that showed a line on the east side of Lake Nipigon coming up, passing near and through the Greenstone area, moving on and up to the Ring of Fire, and bringing power not only to Greenstone, but to the Matawa First Nations and to the Ring of Fire. Now, this year the map's changed a little more, a bit. And why it's changed a bit, or this is last year's map, is the reality is that now you have economic possibilities that are formed that means that the line, rather than going as far north, it will travel closer to the Geraldton area first before heading north. But before I go into that, let me go on again. A year ago, the message that we were trying to bring to the province is that the province must recognize that all infrastructure, not just transportation, but all infrastructure had to be planned on a regional basis. And that had to include power. You know, we've come a long way on that, and I'll speak about where we've come, but you'll have to remember that some of the arguments we used a year ago. These are the slides from a year ago. That a transmission line through the Greenstone into the Ring of Fire would provide the electrical grid and connections to the remote Matawa First Nations, would save mining companies millions, hundreds of millions in just the first decade of development, would eliminate the need for over 100 megawatts of dirty diesel. And it's dirty diesel in pristine areas. And it would facilitate hundreds of megawatts of new renewable generation. And really, we summed it up in one clear statement. The province needed to designate a transmission line to the Ring of Fire as a priority transmission project. And I want to spend just a minute reminding you why that's important. Under the Transmission System Code of the Ontario Energy Board, the way we decide who pays for what in transmission power systems in Ontario, there's really only 2 ways for a power line to be built. The one line is it becomes a network asset, or in the parlance of the Ontario Energy Board and the government, could be a priority transmission project. And here in the Northwest, we've seen those. The east-west tie you've heard about that's now going through the environmental assessment and development stage, that was a priority project. What does that mean? That means that all the ratepayers of the province of Ontario, because it benefits the general system, will pay for it in the normal rate structure over the next 40 years. So no particular industry, no particular customer, no particular client in northwestern Ontario or anywhere else in the province has to put up the $400, $500, $600 million, whatever it costs to build that line. Now, they've also declared other priority transmission projects in the past. At the same time they declared that the east-west tie would be a priority project, they declared the line from Dryden to Pickle Lake would be a priority project. And I'm going to talk about that a bit more in the future, but the important part to realize in that, and first of all, I totally support the concept that Dryden to Pickle Lake should be a priority project, because in turns will open up the possibilities of connecting literally dozens of First Nation communities eventually, and it will allow such things as the Musselwhite Mine and others to go. I'm in favor of priority transmission projects, but I also think they should be done fairly, and they should be done equitably across the province. Where have we come since last year? Well, a couple of things we have done. A year ago, we were making the arguments that they should not be using diesel for the Ring of Fire and relying on it for the remote communities. And we now have an open acknowledgement by both the mining companies and by the province that the transmission line is preferable and to diesel generation for supplying the Ring of Fire and the First Nations. I don't think anyone now has any but the long-term goal is definitely a transmission line. Everyone's accepted it. So remember, just a year ago, diesel was going to be the way of the future for supplying the Ring of Fire. We've also come another stage here, which is very applicable to Greenstone, and that Premier Gold, and you're going to hear more, I believe you and Down's on here in an hour or so, talking about their results of their preliminary economic assessment, both for the Hard Rock and the Brookbank projects. These are very important to Greenstone and its growth, and eventually to the Ring of Fire, and I'll show you why. We've also very recently, and I believe TransCanada is going to be making a presentation right after me, talking about their Energy East project. That again is a project that has implications and provides huge justification for why there should be a priority transmission project, at least as far as Greenstone. And very recently, just before Christmas, through the efforts of your mayor and council and the lobbying efforts they've made, we have made a big step forward in that the OPA and the province have confirmed in writing that when the next regional plan comes out, a line on the east side of Lake Nipigon will be shown as one of the options for supplying the Ring of Fire. Just a year ago, there was no such consideration. The last regional plan that came out in the fall never showed anything. The plan that's coming out probably around June will definitely show that the line we've been proposing is a viable option. And by the way, it's not only the viable, it's the cheapest option, even by their own numbers. So progress has been made. But while progress has been made, today we still do not have a priority transmission project designation. And what does that mean? That means that if anybody wants to go forward and build a large industrial thing such as the TransCanada projects or the Premier Gold, unless that gets done, unless a priority transmission project is designated, they were on the hook for what's called a Section 92, i.e. they pay the whole shot. And we all know that projects, whether they be gold mines or whether they be Energy East, are not going to move forward if they have to pay 70 to 80 million extra just to get the power to that location. TransCanada will find other ways to do it. Premier will have to delay. It's my estimation. In summary, what I say today is the timing for the Ring of Fire may be somewhat uncertain. We know it's coming. We know it's way too big not to eventually go forward. But the need for Greenstone itself for power is now more urgent than it was a year ago. Therefore, as a minimum, I think we have to keep the pressure on the province to have a priority transmission project designation for Greenstone. If we just look at the potential new electrical loads within 5 years for Greenstone, and this is without the Ring of Fire. We have Premier Gold's Hard Rock project. Within the first 2 to 3 years of operation, that will require 40 to 50 megawatts is the latest of new generation. Premier's Brookbank would require another 12 to 15. TransCanada's Energy East, if they're going to be supplied from the power system, there are 3 sites in the Geraldton region. Each of those sites will require 15 to 20 megawatts. And then there's talk about the Long Lac Mill, 5 megawatts. So in the next 5 years, there could be between 100 and 130 megawatts of new power requirements. Why no priority transmission project for Greenstone? Let's look at how do you get a priority transmission project? I mentioned before that the province has designated the transmission line from Dryden to Pickle Lake as such a project. It did so in 2011. It did so, by the way, despite all the talk. This was before there was any talk of supplying the Ring of Fire with anything but diesel, and definitely not from Pickle. It was based on the load projections for Pickle at the time and the concept of getting to some of the remote communities north of Pickle. When the province designated Pickle Lake, these are the words they used. A priority transmission investment project for system reliability, for servicing new load, for new renewable incorporation, i.e. hydroelectric, wind, solar, and for remote community connections. Let's look at that relative to Greenstone. For system reliability, the people that live in Greenstone that have been provided solely by the A4L for the last few decades, we know the reliability record of the A4L. When we talk about new load, we just talked about 100 to 130 megs within the next 5 years, not counting the Ring of Fire as potential new load. Renewable incorporation, one of the things I pointed out last year, that if you took a block of property 50 kilometers each side of that proposed transportation route that Cliffs had from Nakina up to their project, 50 kilometers each side of that line, over 1,000 megs of hydroelectric potential has already been developed or identified, not developed, because it's never going to be developed unless there's a power line. It's a catch-22. No single power development could afford to pay for the whole line. But once the line is built, there's 1,000 megs of identifiable hydroelectric potential within 50 kilometers of each side of that line. And the remote community connections. The original plan to connect the remote communities coming out of Pickle, in fact, never connected all of the Matawa communities. Put another way, when Pickle Lake subsystem, and this is from the last OPA's north of Dryden report, the one that will be modified to include the line on the east side of Nipigon. But from that, this is the Ontario Power Authority's predictions, these aren't mine. Pickle Lake subsystem will need at most 20 megs of additional capacity by 2018, growing to 31 megs by 2023. We're talking about Greenstone having up to 130 megs of potential requirements by 2019. Maybe earlier, depending on when you believe Energy East and Premier would go into existence. 100 to 130 megawatts by 2018. And accepting the concept that eventually the Ring of Fire is coming forward, there's another 70 to 100 megawatts within 5 years after that. Greenstone's, I mentioned earlier, sole supply is right now is a single 115 kV circuit called the A4L that originates near Nipigon. It's actually near the plants on the Nipigon River. Here we have a case where Greenstone's near-term requirements exceed, near-term, not long-term, not potential, not with Ring of Fire, near-term requirements could exceed 100 megawatts. The available capacity on the A4L is 15 to 20 megawatts. How much it'll be will depend on where it is. That's one of the things you'll find if you're in the transmission business. People will say, well, how much room is there left on the A4L? Well, if you were putting the new load 5 miles from the Nipigon River, you probably could put 30 megs on that line. But if you're going to put it all the way up at Geraldton, where the hard rock mine is, you probably only have 15 to 20 megs. You barely have enough to begin the operation of the hard rock mine. Forget everything else, and if you did that, you wouldn't have any room to put anything else on. And simply, it's not, people talk to me about the technical issues related to electricity. It's relatively simple for Greenstone. If there's no new power supply, there's very limited growth for Greenstone. Industry doesn't grow without power. And therefore, the population doesn't grow without power. I guess the argument that I know your council and your mayor and staff have been making with the province, and I think we're getting some headway, is why does the province continue to treat Greenstone differently than Pickle? We're totally in favor of Pickle getting a designated line, not an issue. The question is, when does Greenstone do it? I also want to bring out something that's come up more recently and this is using, again, the OPA's own numbers. And I call it the great costing inequity. If you try to supply the Ring of Fire from Pickle, you need two things. First of all, besides just building a line from Pickle to the Ring of Fire and what that would cost, you have to do two other things that people aren't fully recognizing because they're calling them network costs. First, and this is only recently admitted to by the OPA, is that new transmission facilities have to be built between Thunder Bay and Dryden. We've heard about getting up to Pickle from Dryden, but only recently have they published what they call the Northwest Transmission Project. You'll find that only slipped in the latest documents, which readily admits that they don't have enough transmission between Thunder Bay itself and Dryden to support the load they're predicting north of Pickle. So besides having to build a line from Dryden to Pickle, they also have to reinforce the lines to get there. And they'd also have to increase, if they want to go bigger than the original designation, they want to supply the Ring of Fire, rather than build the proposed 115 kV circuit that was going to go from Dryden to Pickle for that 20 to 30 megs of new load, they'd have to build a 230 kV line as their designation. Because when they designated the circuit, they didn't say what size or what it would cost. But when they designated, the intention was a 115. The additional costs, according to their own calculations, of just getting from Dryden to Pickle, the difference between building it at 115 and building it big enough at 230 to handle the Ring of Fire load is $109 million for that section. The costs for the new transmission line from Thunder Bay to Dryden, the facilities, have not yet been costed out. But the transmission line distance, because it has to first go to Atikokan and then up, works out to 400 kilometers. 400 kilometers is the approximate distance of the new east-west tie. And even if you looked at the new east-west tie, although this will be simpler, knows that we're talking hundreds of millions or more. Put another way, the new incremental costs, the ones that have been announced after the concept of a line from Dryden to Pickle, is forecast to far exceed the cost of a new 230 line to Greenstone. In fact, the incremental costs, the new costs, the ones to build this new capacity, are more than the total costs produced by the OPA or forecast by the OPA to build a line from down at Kama Bay, Nipigon, through Geraldton, and all the way to the Ring of Fire. What makes it different? All of the additional costs we're talking about are upgrading costs and are determined at the current thing to be network costs. Network costs, I'll come back to the beginning, are paid for through the normal transmission rates. So the industries, there will be charges to Musselwhite for the extensions beyond Pickle and that. But the industries that get there, all the costs behind there, the costs down and through and all the way back to Thunder Bay will be built into network costs. And therefore, it will proceed. They'll be paid for by all the ratepayers. I guess the simplest non-technical position I would put forward is that Greenstone and the Matawa First Nations deserve equitable access to energy and equitable opportunity for growth. And to do that, it's the same as what we said a year ago. The province needs to designate at least the transmission line to Greenstone as a first step, as a priority transmission project. I'll leave you there and then open it to questions. Clear as mud? Oh, here, sorry. Yeah. I took it. Just yell, Bruce.
I've got laryngitis today, but I'll do my best. There we go.
Okay.
We have amplification. Larry, I accept all your good presentation. I even understood it. Thank you. I accept all your premises, your assumptions. They are reasonable. So I believe that if we look at 10 years, we probably need 200 megs, which seems to be in the ballpark of what you're talking about. So here's my simplistic question. How much of that potentially could we make up with two other sources besides the east-west line, the west to east line? And those two are, how much undeveloped hydroelectric capacity through low-head hydro, undeveloped sites, et cetera, might we have here in northwestern Ontario? And the other one is connection with the Manitoba grid. And utilizing some Manitoba power. Okay. Well, I'm not sure I can give you totally definitive, but I mentioned earlier, we do know that the Ontario Water Power Association, funded by the provincial government, has done a study of undeveloped hydroelectric sites in Northern Ontario recently. And they did identify that, as I mentioned from last year's, if you just took a 50-kilometer swath each side of where the proposed corridor, there's 1,000 megs of undeveloped hydroelectric. You said low head. I mean, low head means different things to different technical people. I do not believe that 1,000 megs will ever be developed, but 100 to 200 megs of it could readily be developed and would provide a good income for the First Nations that would be involved in developing it. So that's a possibility. The question, though, of developing it without a connection, a transmission for stability, is technically fraught with danger because of the water level. You're still going to need a transmission line. You need the transmission line to hook it in. So you need the line, but there are readily projects. It's a Little Jackfish project, which is
I believe 74 megs is a potential, but there's another 1,000 up there. So it's all, it could be supplied that way, but you're still going to need a transmission line. The amount to bring it in from Manitoba, if you built more transmission, obviously we could bring in more power from Manitoba than we currently have. However, it's a long way to get that power from Manitoba to Greenstone or the Ring of Fire. I don't think, although it might adjust the rates in northwestern Ontario, I'm not sure that it's practical to say that Manitoba Hydro's power could supply Greenstone. Really, what we need is a transmission line that opens the door to a number of things. So I can't readily tell you, Bruce, how Manitoba Hydro power would affect it. It would require major transmission facilities which inherently are very costly to come that distance, because I worked on that twice. We're first negotiating the transmission line cost was Manitoba to come from Kanawapa, and then negotiating the settlement when we didn't go forward and what it cost us to break that deal. So it's a very expensive opportunity. Any other questions? Well, I think the important part to say is that Greenstone really does have to keep the pressure on the province to make sure that you do have the power. You need roads to go forward. You need telecommunications to go forward. You need power. You need a number of things to make the infrastructure work. You fail in any one of those, it's very hard to have economic growth. And right now, a very great threat to Greenstone's growth has got to be the fact that you have very limited room from a power perspective. Thank you very much.